there's no Christmas story in the Gospel of Mark. And the letters of Paul, these long epistles describing the Christian life, they never tell us any of the birth stories of Jesus. Instead, Paul and Mark both use this phrase. It was the fullness of time. Or Paul says, when the fullness of time came. Or Mark begins, actually in the words of Jesus, all time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. The fullness of time. Isn't that a lovely phrase? It's grand, but it's also mysterious and powerful. The fullness of time. But I wonder, what does the fullness of time mean for those of us who are feeling pretty empty? Feeling pretty empty. Now, I'll say there are Christian historians who have bent over backwards trying to prove that the phrase fullness of time actually means the perfect time. They make these historical arguments. They're trying to argue that the Roman transportation system and the relative peace and this shared language of Greek and even the efficiencies in shipping, all of these things historically come together to make it the perfect time for the Messiah to be born and for the Christian message to spread most rapidly. And I don't want to sound like rude, but this historical argument is so absurd when you look at how terrible the timing really was. When we listen to Luke and Matthew, we very quickly realize that there is no way that the fullness of time could mean the perfect time. It's almost the opposite. We read Luke and Matthew. It was the worst possible time in the worst possible place with the worst possible people. We look at this story, and the faith of the people was dying, and it was being corrupted by the temptations of power and the seeming silence of God. It was the fullness of time, but the location was completely out of the way and removed almost utterly from any access to influence. Instead, it was in the firing line of racism and empire oppression and ethnic violence. It was the fullness of time. But all of the characters in the story were a pretty sorry lot of embarrassment and rejection. You have Zechariah. He is an old man serving as a part-time temple priest in a practice that seemed like a has-been farce. This temple project, it felt like a failure to everyone. The Messiah promise was pretty confusing, and all of these religious factions were taking measures into their own hands. So who is Zechariah? And where's the fullness for him? And then there's Elizabeth, who's an old lady with no children. How many times had folks whispered behind Elizabeth's back? How many times have they made awkward comments to her face? What is it that you have done, Elizabeth? How have you messed up to be such a sad failure in the eyes of everybody? Who is Elizabeth? Who is Elizabeth? And where was the fullness for her? And then there's Joseph. He's out there trying to figure out life in a time when taxes were high and business was low. When the government was making life impossible. And his new fiance turns out to be a major embarrassment. His marriage, Joseph's marriage, was supposed to be a big social step for him. But this girl was threatening to ruin his whole family with a scandal. Who is this Joseph character, and where's the fullness for him? And then there's Mary, of course. I think that she knows better than any of the folks. She's like, I'm not much to look at. And I don't have any power, and I don't have anything to stand on. This is Mary. She's young, and she's vulnerable, and she's powerless. And this wild vision of God and her shocking pregnancy, they are going to bring her family and her social life and her hopes to a screeching and terrifying halt. And her only option now in life is to abscond off to a tiny hill town and stay with her relative Elizabeth a while. Who is Mary? And what is fullness for her? What is the fullness of time when you're feeling pretty empty? It is not the perfect time, and you are not the perfect person, but still, God says now. Still, God says it is at hand. The fullness of time. How did all of these imperfect people get the strength to say yes? And how did all of these imperfect folks in the most imperfect situations find the audacity to say yes? Yeah, it took 9 months for Zechariah to find his voice, but when he did, he sang quite the song. And Joseph never speaks in the stories. He just dreams. And somehow he finds the strength to stay at Mary's side through it all. And Elizabeth somehow knows how to say yes without even understanding anything. She says, I don't understand, but behold. And then Mary, somehow Mary finds the ancient words that she memorized as a little girl. In that moment of fear and confusion and anxiety, Mary starts singing the ancient song of Hannah. And she has the audacity to put a twist on it. She takes the ancient words of Hannah and she has the audacity to say, yes, I will sing along and I will put myself into the story too. How do we, like them, step into the fullness of time, even when we're feeling pretty empty? How do imperfect people in the worst possible situations step into God's fullness of time? I wonder if it doesn't have something to do with where we direct our eyes and what we choose to listen to. I mean, are we directing our eyes at all of the evidence that we are the most imperfect people? Are we choosing to listen to all of the proof that this is the worst possible time? Or are we listening to God's ancient song instead? Someone reminded me the other day of a time when I felt so completely imperfect. It was 5 years ago, and one of the most imperfect times I've ever experienced. There were buses rolling up into our church parking lot every hour 5 years ago, and they were dropping off 45 women and children at a time. They were coming from the immigration prisons. Mothers with nothing more than a shopping bag of possessions in all the world. And they were carrying their children up the steps into our sanctuary as the temperatures started dropping and the wind felt icy that year. And at first, we thought we had enough inflatable mattresses and space in the fellowship hall. But the buses didn't stop coming. And we just kept saying yes. We just kept saying yes. And I will tell you, I was the most unprepared and inadequate leader. I knew that these women and children would be out in the cold streets if we didn't let them in. But I also did not know how to fix our heating system that was petering out. And I did not know how to fix the fuses that kept blowing. And I did not know how to channel enough resources or where the food would come from. And we ran out of room in that fellowship hall. And all of Sunday, we were clearing out Sunday school rooms, and those were very quickly filled. And then we had to move all of the Christmas decorations in the sanctuary. We moved the pews to the side. And there were 20 people sleeping where we normally have a pulpit and a pretty little manger scene. And I honestly did not know how to deal with all the people who were around me and all the people who were mad at me. I was completely inadequate and I had no answers. You know that feeling. You feel overwhelmed and you feel inadequate, and you know you need to figure things out. You know you need to do better, but you have no time to think. And on top of that, people are mad at you. We had about 500 mothers just out of immigration prison who were so frustrated that we didn't have enough phones to call family and make connections. And the congregational chair was mad at me because I hadn't communicated the scope of the need adequately. And the fire chief was furious at me that I had let all these folks into our building and was even talking about pressing charges for endangerment. And there was this guy who's running the immigration prisons who was really, really angry at me because a news story had broken that made him look really bad, and they were using a quote from me. And there was an infectious disease doctor who was really mad at me that we had no shelter protocols set up, and they were looking for these dangerous diseases and saying that we were putting everyone at risk. And I felt so worthless and dumb and ill-prepared, and still, our building was packed with desperate people. It was day 3 of this, and I was trying to sleep upstairs. I was at the top of the stairs, at that intersection of the whole building, and I could not sleep. I remember looking at my watch and seeing that it was 2 a.m. And that year there was this government contractor who had installed GPS ankle shackles on all of these mothers while they were in the immigration prison. Every woman in this building of ours had a big plastic shackle on their ankle. And this government contractor had programmed these shackles to beep every 60 seconds. I don't know why. It felt like sonic terrorism. But you take a beep every 60 seconds and you spread that out over 500 people in a building at 2 a.m. and you have this cacophony of beeps. And on top of that is all these coughing, exhausted mothers, and this chorus of tracking beeps. And I was so tired. And on top of that, I could hear these voices of people having nightmares. The voices of children crying out. And mothers making those unintelligible nightmare signs. And I was lying right here. This is the spot. I was lying right here. And I felt like I was drowning in this ocean of human hurt and desperation. And I had no answers. And I had no ideas. and I couldn't even rest. And I think every single one of you listening to this knows that exact 2 a.m. feeling. To not be enough and to feel empty and to know that you have to do better, but not know how. And I remember tears started to fill my eyes. And then I heard something marvelous. It was down in the far corner of the fellowship hall. I heard a mother start to sing a lullaby, a 2 a.m. lullaby. And she was not singing quietly. It echoed through the whole building, but she was singing soothingly. It felt like confident love, this lullaby in the noise. And suddenly it was, y'all, the only thing I could focus on. This soothing, confident love. I love that memory. I love thinking back on that sound, that 2 a.m. lullaby floating through the darkness and all the noise. And when I'm feeling like I'm not enough and the world is too much, I think about that lullaby voice. Over and through the din of coughing and beeping and nightmares. I love that memory of that sound of that 2 a.m. lullaby. What if we could focus on God's song? That song that fills up time, even when we are feeling empty. What if we could focus in on God's song that fills up time? And maybe even receive the audacity to sing along like Mary and Elizabeth and Zachariah, those imperfect people in an imperfect time. Or maybe just like Joseph, we never find words, but we stay there. We remain in the presence of miracle and we do not look away. It is the fullness of time. And yes, there's so much evidence and noise saying that we are empty. And that's fine. We can just let that lie where it may. But it is the fullness of time. And God is saying now. So let's train our eyes and our ears on that song. It is the fullness of time. And we say, amen.